Hi, welcome back to the Personality Hacker Podcast. My name is Joel Mark Witt.
And I'm Antonia Dodge.
In just a moment, we are going to jump into an interview with Dana, who identifies as an INFP personality type. A few things to keep in mind before we get started. First, we may use some technical and shorthand language in this interview. So if you want to download a handy guide that will help you visually follow along what we're talking about, visit personalityhacker.com, and you can find that PDF directly below this episode. Second, I want to draw your attention to Dana, who has been through our profiler training program. She knows type and she knows herself very well. So with this in mind, I want to encourage you to look past any stereotypes you may have for the INFP personality. If you're brand new to type, I stands for introvert, N stands for intuitive, F stands for feeler, P stands for perceiver. These four letters are called dichotomies, and they're what most people know about personality type. But the true power of the system comes from understanding personality on a much deeper level. These are called cognitive functions. And in this interview with Dana, we're going to dive into these deeper waters. To get an overview of the cognitive functions for INFPs, search our podcast we've already recorded. It's called INFP Personality Type Advice. Of course, the functions can also be a bit technical at times, so I want to remind you there's that handy PDF guide you can download directly below this episode. Just head over to personalityhacker.com and you can find that PDF there. Today, we have a special guest on the show. Her name is Dana Jacobson. Dana, welcome to Personality Hacker.
Thank you so much for having me.
So Dana, we invited you to come on today because you identify as an INFP in the Myers-Briggs system. You've also been part of our profiler training program for, probably over a half a decade now at this point.
I think it's so.
Yeah. And so you know type pretty well. You've obviously been through our program. You're an INFP who's been on your own growth journey. We want to talk a little bit about that today. Before we get into some specific questions and talking about your type, what do we need to know about Dana to get to know you before we start?
Well, let's see. I am 54 now. I live alone. I have organized my life to fully embrace my need for alone time and also connection. So I have several part-time jobs, most of which involve children, and some of which involve things like organizing spaces and making things, sort of helping behind the scenes. So I do administrative work for a preschool. I do childcare and home organization. I love kids, but I don't have any of my own. I have 10 of other people's children, which is really how I like it, because then I come home and sleep all night long. Those are the main things. And I have a lot of family in the Pacific Northwest, so a lot of time with family and friends.
So how did you discover type? And then how did you discover your own best fit type of INFP?
So originally, I have completely forgotten, but I did do a Myers-Briggs inventory in college, and I actually can't remember what my results were. Then a few years later, when I was teaching first grade, our school did it, and I remember thinking that I had ISFJ preferences. I don't know if that's what my results were, but that's what I remember. So, and then, 10 years or so after that, I was talking to a friend and I said, yeah, I ISFJ, and she just kind of laughed at me. She was very familiar with type. She's like, yeah, you really don't have a sensing preference. She meant in the front seat. She didn't use that terminology, but so I discovered, I'm an INFJ. And then when I discovered Personality Hacker and went through the profiling certification, towards the end of my certification process, they said, you might want to consider that you have a preference for perceiving and not judging. And I, of course, at that time especially, had a lot of type pride and, I'm a special INFJ, and how can I possibly be a dreaded perceiver? I prided myself on being very organized and things. And I kind of sat with it for, I don't know, 6 or 8 weeks. And at the end of that time, I was just, and I'm still like, how could I ever have thought that I was an INFJ? Because I so fully feel my INFP preference very strongly now. And now, especially knowing the differences between introverted feeling authenticity versus extroverted feeling harmony, I still on internet sites test out with INFJ preferences, but it's all due to family of origin and how I grew up and that kind of thing. It was amazing to finally realize and embrace that I prefer INFP.
Mm. And especially since you said when you were explaining yourself or like sort of what we need to know about Dana, you said you do home organization. And I would imagine that probably really threw it off.
Yes. And that actually happened after I identified as INFP instead of INFJ. But I have discovered that my little baby 3-year-old extroverted thinking plays well with my introverted feeling and values of how can I make things useful for people and set systems in place, so not complicated systems, like the simpler the better. But for example, I was able to declutter my house. I did the whole Marie Kondo life-changing magic of tidying up thing for a year. And I have pieces of my life set in systems that I can maintain. And that's pretty huge because, again, one thing I did not realize before this whole type journey was that I am kind of a big system breaker. Surprise, surprise.
Mm-hmm. And so for you, then, part of the reason why you got into organization is because it really had an impact on you, it sounds like. Is there like an interesting way that you go about organization that is different than other home organizers?
Well, I like to describe it as I feel like I stand around. Well, okay, first I, talk to the person that I'm organizing for, and we either do it together or separately, but I do have to interview them at the beginning to know how they use their space. But then I do feel like I stand around and stare at it all for a long time, and it looks like I'm just doing nothing. I don't know what's happening in my head because it doesn't feel like anything's going on. And then all of a sudden, I just sort of start putting things into places. And the next thing you know, it's all looks really great. And the person is like, oh, this is I can't believe I never thought of this. This is exactly how I can use this best. And it's very mysterious to me.
Well, it sounds like a very intuitive process that's going on for you. You're looking at the space.
Yes.
And you're almost just letting your intuition see it, absorb the information, and then just all of a sudden make connections. And it sounds like what you're really adding value to a client around is creative solutions for using their space, maybe in a way that was counterintuitive or they hadn't thought of before.
Yes. Yeah. And my extroverted intuition exploration plays a huge role. And really, even my 10-year-old introverted sensing memory is very much involved because I'm kind of thinking, how can this be a long-term, like a system that makes sense and you can carry into the future. It's one of those things that I feel like the extroverted thinking effectiveness and introverted sensing memory are so intertwined in the process that I can't even sort of separate them out almost.
Like your little inner ESTJ comes out and helps you. Yeah.
Yes, very much so.
So when you discovered or realized that you were actually an INFP and not an INFJ, like the recommendations for growth strategies are quite different. Extroverted intuition or exploration is very different than extroverted feeling or harmony. Can you talk a little bit about how, like how did that impact you when you're like, oh, I'm actually an INFP, I'm using totally different functions. Did it end up encouraging to go like a different direction in your growth, or did you change your life around to be more ergonomic for you?
You know, one of the most impactful pieces of that, all of that, was I finally understood why I really am not that great at extroverted feeling. And I had thought that I was because I genuinely like people, I care about them. And so I felt like a lot of my decisions were based on what is going to be best for everyone. But my decisions were really all about what do I feel is right. Like that was always the fundamental bottom line that I didn't even recognize. So when I learned all this and then realized, oh, I definitely have introverted feeling, it was kind of a relief because I no longer felt like I quote unquote should be working on the extroverted feeling as my co-pilot.
Mm-hmm.
I could kind of let some of that go
Mm-hmm.
because it was like, oh, I'm not wired for that. So it makes more sense to let my intuition, feed my intuition, that extroverted intuition, and use what the information that I gather there to inform, because of course I still care about people, but let that inform my values so that I still can try to meet people's needs, but in an introverted feeling kind of way, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
It in some ways was harder at the beginning just to wrap my head around, oh, wait, I'm sort of not who I thought I was. But then it was much more relaxing in terms of what I actually would do with the information.
Sometimes I've heard from people who are IFPs that when they realize that they're not using extroverted feeling, they give themselves permission to be, and this is their language, by the way, and this might resonate with you, but almost permission to be selfish or like
Yes.
self-referencing, not selfish, but more self-referencing.
Yes. And it did really open up to me the difference between what I think, this is my own assumption, but what I think a lot of extroverted feeling people might consider to be selfish versus, oh, when I'm referencing myself and my own values in terms of making decisions, that's, as you guys say, that's my genius. If I get all of the information through my intuition and then use that to inform my values, that's when I make my best decisions, and it's not selfish.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes my decisions may seem to be selfish to somebody who's using extroverted feeling or harmony, but they're not, because I'm not that person.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, because
sort of that.
Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
I was just going to say, it's sort of that, to a certain extent, it's put the airbag. It's not the airbag, the airplane, if you're crashing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the mask.
The oxygen mask. Thank
Right,
you,
yeah.
The oxygen mask on yourself.
Right. Because what you're talking about is filtering through your decisions through your own personal set of values, right? As introverted feeling or authenticity. And you have decided to not, one of your values is that you're not going to be a selfish person.
Yes, exactly.
Right.
Yeah.
So, and I think that's again, that is a relief because, with extroverted feeling or harmony, checking in, trying to get everybody's needs met, that even people who have that function oftentimes struggle to figure out boundaries.
Yes.
And I think when an INFP goes, oh, I don't have to worry about that thing. Like that, my boundaries are actually, I'm going to focus on the process of becoming the best version of myself.
Yes.
And woven into there is going to be its own form of boundaries. Does that make sense?
Yes. Yes. And that is, you've articulated it very, very well, because that's very much how I feel.
So you've mentioned it a couple of times, getting information through your intuition and then kicking it over to introverted feeling or authenticity. Can you talk a little bit about what you personally do in your life to get enough of that auxiliary function or co-pilot function of extroverted intuition or exploration to get enough good quality information to kick it over to your driver of introverted feeling?
That is a really good question, because I've, in the recent past, the last 5 years, kind of agonized over, am I really doing extroverted intuition? because when I was in my 20s, I was very fortunate and able to travel a lot, which was great because I desperately wanted to. And so, then in my late 40s and 50s, I'm thinking, well, I'm not really traveling anymore and I really don't want to. And now I've realized that, for one thing, because I've organized my life so differently, my life is not a quote unquote normal life in terms of, for probably six or 7 years, I kind of considered myself not to be working, although I was, but I didn't have a quote unquote real job. And I wrote a book. I wrote a couple books and self-published them on Amazon. And I was able to take care of, I did a lot of babysitting because I wanted to hang out with kids. So, oh dear, now I've forgotten the question. Oh yeah, extroverted intuition. So some of that is just really by exploring kind of alternative way, I guess, to live my life, certainly a way that I'd never planned when I was 16 or whatever. And then I think being with a lot of people, well, profiling has helped immensely because as an introverted feeling user, people maybe know that your listening parts of your brain light up when we're using introverted feeling. So I love when I'm profiling people. It's fascinating. I love to hear what their experiences are and the things that they do and have lived and how they think about things. So that's one aspect of it. And then, well, I've forgotten the other one, but it might come back to me.
That's okay. So what I hear you saying then is when you were younger, it was primarily travel, but now it's just having this sort of unconventional lifestyle. It sounds like you've really organized your life for freedom, if that's not a contradiction in terms.
And thank you. And conventional was the word I've been looking for this whole time.
Mm-hmm. And so because of that, you've got this sense of freedom. You're like, I get to go do the things I want to do, but then when I come home, I'm alone. I don't have any I don't have any critical or crucial responsibilities to the outside world in a way that I can't untether and go do the thing that I want to do.
Exactly.
And do you find that like really suits you and helps you grow as a person, as opposed to, like for some people, detethering is something that like the outside world would be like, well, you're just being irresponsible. But for you, it sounds like it's actually facilitated a lot of growth for you.
Yes, very much so. I spent over 20 years in my professional life basically using my 10-year-old and 3-year-old, which again are the introverted sensing memory and extroverted thinking effectiveness, for 20 years. And after the first 3 to 6 months of every new job, was completely miserable for the however many years I remained in it. And I was, well, I do think that I grew through that, but it wasn't a good way to grow for 20 plus years. Mm-hmm. Again, the first 3 to 6 months of the new job were great because I was learning all this fascinating information about things that I never would have been interested in, like medical insurance and stuff. Mm. Then I would get pretty good at it. I would learn that all these great plans and possibilities that I'd seen at the beginning, I was too exhausted to implement. Mm. And they weren't always implementable in the cultures where I was. Creating this unconventional life. And it was interesting because I made the decision, and then about 6 months later, I was able to follow through and quit the job that I was doing at that time. And there were people that I did think that I was irresponsible, but I knew with every fiber of my being that was the right thing to do. And ever since then, it was the best decision I have ever made in my life, because it's like, oh my gosh, even when I'm having a bad day, I still underneath it am happy. And it's kind of like, wow, what a concept, because it was pretty much the other way around when I was, for the most part, during that 20 however many year period.
We will be right back. If you're focused on personal growth, I think you'll resonate with our core content over at personalityhacker.com. We want to see you understand how your mind is wired so you can generate motivation, improve social skills, find career opportunities, and master excellent decision making. But a quick warning, we are advice and action focused in all of our articles, podcasts, and videos. This means that we attract people who like to be challenged to become excellent, to take action, to put in the work to optimize themselves, not simply just gather more information. If you are committed to personal growth and ready to radically find your inner truth, then come over and be a part of our growing community of like minds at Personality Hacker. Now back to the show. I want to highlight something that you are alluding to. I don't know if you've used this word yet in this conversation, but you were saying, even when I have a bad day, I'm okay. And what I hear in that is that your introverted feeling authenticity part of you has created a sovereignty to your life. You've carved out this, like an independent country that's sovereign is self-contained. You have a self-contained sovereignty to your existence now.
Yes.
And that feels good because no matter what happens to you, you're still a sovereign person with yourself.
Yes, very much so. And in fact, I listened to all of the interviews in the Empowered program that you guys did.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And the one with Paul, he talked a lot about being sovereign and having sovereignty. And oh boy, did I ever resonate with that.
Yeah, he was talking about, because he's a multimillionaire, INFP.
Self-made.
Yes.
And he was talking about how he basically turned his creative business ideas into his art, and that was helped him, like that's how he identified with it. And he was talking about sovereignty. Yeah, that's a fantastic interview in that program.
That whole program was amazing.
Cool. So this idea of sovereignty then, so that feels settled, that feels stable to you. You feel like you're yourself now.
Mm-hmm.
And we talked a little bit about how being self-focused or self-referenced first isn't selfish for you, because how I interpret that is the most personal things to us typically are universal. In other words, if you get really into how you feel about something on a personal level, at the deep parts of your heart, the true nature of what you feel about something, you can go, I bet most people would feel this way in a similar situation. And I've noticed as an FI user, introverted feeling authenticity user, that helps me have more empathy for people because I get the empathy for myself first, then I can cast it outward.
Yes. Oh boy, is that ever true. Because when I'm, say, feeling grumpy with somebody, the way they're doing it or something, and I am able to stop and think of and it has to be, for me at least, a very specific, similar situation where I was acting similarly to the person, that's when I can say, oh yeah, I've been there. That person is, has their reasons, they're having a rough time, whatever it is. But that's when I can get empathetic and really care about the other person instead of feeling all grumpy that they're not doing what I think they should be doing right that moment.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. You mentioned before that the lifestyle that you had led, and by the way, did you make these changes after you discovered you were an INFP, or were you basically already making these changes? And then when you realized you were an INFP, you're like, oh, that makes sense.
The latter. Mm-hmm. Yeah, this was all before I was familiar with type, but not very familiar with type. And after quitting my conventional lifestyle and job, I then was like, oh, I have all this time now. And I've always been interested in personality type, and especially the Myers-Briggs. So yeah, all of that went into effect before I dove deep into the intricacies of type.
So then actually the lifestyle that you're leading, or the decision to not be conventional, the decision to go your own direction, be sovereign, live an unconventional lifestyle, has actually allowed you to pursue more extroverted intuition things. And so it's almost like it's generative.
Yes, because when I was living, the 9-to-5 job, Monday through Friday life, I would come home in the evenings and do nothing. I mean, I had no energy for, I think I played a lot of solitaire on my iPad.
Yeah.
And, I just didn't want to do anything.
Yeah.
And now I actually, really, my problem now is that most things sound fun. And so my problem is really that I say yes without taking into account that, okay, I need a certain amount of downtime. If I do keep saying yes to all these fun opportunities, I'm not going to enjoy any of them at a certain point. So it's kind of the complete opposite of where I was before.
You had to get to the place where things resonate with you on the opposite side. Like at first it was like nothing resonated. You were just kind of bored and didn't have anything to attune to.
Burned out too.
And now you have so many things, you've got to use that same attunement to say, okay, what do I actually want to focus on? Because there's so much available to me, opportunity-wise.
Yes,
That's
exactly.
Powerful. What's the cost? What's the cost for you as an INFP to be in this space, though? Because, it's hard won. You got yourself here, but what did you have to give up to be in this place?
Oh, that is a great question. Well, I did have to give up financial security in some ways. I mean, I don't have a very regular paycheck. Well, now I do, but for several years, 7 years or whatever, I did not have a monthly paycheck that I knew I was going to get every month or 2 weeks or whatever. On the other hand, I had saved a lot of money in order to be able to do this in the first place. And originally my idea was, well, I'm going to figure out what job is it that I want to do. And in 6 months, I'll go, this is like a sabbatical. I really did not think of it as a way of life, except that when the 6 months point hit, I was kind of like, yeah, no, I'm not going. I still don't know what I want to do. And I really don't want to go back to regular life. So at that point, I kind of started looking into part-time work, but that I liked. So I volunteered at a really great charity called Child Haven in the baby room because I love babies. And then I ended up volunteering at my church in the infant room and the toddler room. And then that turned into a part-time job that was fairly regular. So had I not saved up as much money as I had, I doubt that I would have felt comfortable making such a big decision. But then once I did, it was kind of like, well, I live pretty cheaply. I rarely go out to eat because I don't want to, and everybody thinks I'm crazy. But I have to say, when the pandemic hit, as I'm sure many introverts have said, I really was just happy as a clam. And it also worked. My dad was ill and he died last year, but I was able to live with my parents for 3 months in the spring and then like 6 months or so from the fall into this previous spring. And I wouldn't have been able to do that had I not made the choices that I've made. So I kind of really feel like what I gave up was so not even comparable. There's no weight on that side of the scale because all of the weight has been on the, wow, this was the best decision I ever made for myself.
We've basically over the past year been talking a lot about this idea of one-sidedness, which is a Jungian term. Jung uses the term one-sided, which is this idea of a person who is so doubled down on their cognitive functions, or basically how they're naturally wired, that they can't see outside of that. And when Jung talked about the specific functions in that way, he basically pathologized them. And I've noticed that there's a good and bad thing about being an INFP in this world, because it's very obvious that ESTJ preferences are very rewarded, particularly in Western culture, and I would say maybe even more particularly in American culture. And so because of that, a lot of INFPs get propagandized to not be INFPs, right? To not be in their strengths, to be in their less, like the functions that they get maybe built more sophisticated than other types in their 3-year-old and 10-year-old or inferior and tertiary, because the world, just sort of pushes them in that space so frequently and rewards those behaviors so much and punishes the other behaviors. that a lot of INFPs, they're almost by society forced to not be one-sided. And then they've got to find their way back home. Does that make sense? And that's what I'm
Yes.
hearing. And so you're like, I saved up
Yes.
all this money. Well, saving up all this money may or may not be an INFP thing to do on their own
Right.
devices. But when you were in that space, you saved up all this money, and then it gave you freedom to be able to find your way back home. And so can you talk a little bit about the journey that you went through, not just like in a, the logistical journey is I quit my job, I took a sabbatical, the sabbatical ended up becoming a lifestyle, I live very simply in order to do that. But can you talk about what happened for you cognitively as you went from the journey of being in those lesser preferred functions up into being, like into your true INFP functions?
Oh, yes. I would say so from late teens, early 20s, and all through my 20s, I really struggled with depression. I finally figured out that part of it was it got really bad when I was teaching first grade and then second grade. So I stopped that. That whole 20 plus year period where I was sort of being quote unquote my ESTJ self, I really struggled with depression. Luckily, I was able to take medication and it helped immensely. But basically, I finally realized 7, 8 years ago that I was going to continue to have problems with depression even while on medication until I figured out, in that period at least, I was thinking, what job did I want to do? Till I found something that was the right work fit for me. So I didn't really, through that period, it was mostly feeling like I would have good days or weeks or whatever. But there was kind of always this fear that, I'm going to end up in the sad place again. And so saving that money, which I had originally saved because I thought I was going to move into a bigger place and I was going to get a baby grand piano, and I was very excited. And then 2008 happened, and so clearly I was not going to be moving. When I even just had the idea of I could quit my job and really take time to figure out what do I want to do with my life, work-wise and sort of in the bigger picture. There was this, it's not like a light bulb went off, but it was just like this feeling of, oh, wow, that would be amazing. And then I made it happen. And oh my goodness, the whole first month, I did nothing. I didn't say yes to anything. I just did whatever I wanted to do in the moment. And I can hardly even articulate how amazing it was. The following, what I really wanted to do was the hugest life change in the most positive way that I could ever have imagined. And now I've forgotten the original question again.
Well, what was going on for you as you were navigating the space of being in such a sort of an ESTJ lifestyle, going into your INFP preferences? What was happening
Thank
for you
you.
sort of internally?
Yes. So then after I made the change finally and had this huge sense of relief, I didn't think so much about, well, what's the practical choice to make? What's the quote unquote smart thing to do? I chose to do the things that I wanted to do. And it wasn't just, oh, I don't want to work, so I'm not going to work. It was, oh, I am fascinated by personality type, so I'm going to find ways to learn more about it, which is in 2014 when I came on. You guys had just started like 4 months before I discovered you. It was very exciting. And then I continued to make my choices that way. Of course, I still struggled with the little voice in the head that's always telling you, well, you should do this or you should do that. But I got better and better at really focusing on what feels right to me. what is the choice? What is it that I really truly want to do? And I did a lot of journaling about what kind of person do I want to be? What is it that I want out of my life? I did some classes with friends who were building a coaching business and learned a ton too. And they are partly how I got more and more into type, because they kind of encouraged me to, you got to run with this. You got to really think what feels right to your core and then choose that way. So it was really just that it was almost a switch between, okay, I'm going to do all of the things the practical, reasonable, prudent way, to no, I don't care if it's practical, reasonable, and prudent. I am going to do what I really want to do. And of course, I had a lot of habits that were practical and reasonable and frugal. So I didn't completely go off the deep end and, I don't know, fly to Tahiti or something, but I didn't want to either.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah.
What I hear you saying is that you swapped the question in your mind for what's practical and what I should be doing to what's fascinating me right now and what's right for me right now.
Yes.
Yeah. So as you go through this shift, I imagine that, the earlier bouts you had with depression were probably like, that was, I'm sure, its own emotional space to navigate. Did you come to this place, you're like, even if I have a bad day, I know I'm going to be happy. I'm going to be fine, because you're in this place of sovereignty. Oh,
yeah.
Were some of those emotional, I'm sure you're very tapped into what is going on for you emotionally at any given moment, leading with introverted feeling or authenticity. But I've noticed
far too much sometimes.
Yeah. I've noticed sometimes with INFPs, though, if they're kind of, what we talk about, loop, when they're really associated with their introverted sensing or memory, sometimes the emotions can get habituated. It's almost like they're in there because they've been in there for so long. So was that something you had to navigate through too as well, going like, why am I feeling this way? Am I allowed to feel a different way? And what does that look like?
Yes. I had a really huge limiting belief that the way I was or who I was not okay. And this friend's coaching business, they were learning about neurolinguistic programming. I said, well, hey, if you want to practice on me. And so that was actually, for me, now I can't remember the actual exercise, but we had this one session and it was the weirdest thing, because I would have these mental habits of thinking and feeling. And then I went through this NLP exercise with this coach. And for, a week to 10 days, it was bizarre, because I could literally feel my brain trying to go down the thought pattern that I had set, or the feelings that I'd had as a habit. And they kind of weren't there anymore because of this neurolinguistic programming exercise. At one point, I couldn't even remember what the thoughts were that I had been trying to change, because they weren't there anymore. Like, I just wasn't doing them. And that opened up space for me to, one of my big values is to be a positive, look for the bright side, partly because of dealing so much with depression. But I really believe that for me personally, it is important to look at what are all the things I can be grateful for? What are the good things in my life? And going through that NLP exercise really opened up a space where I could sort of have that mental and emotional freedom from the habits to build new ones, the ones that I wanted. I mean, that it was, I'd kind of forgotten about it until you just asked that, but it was an amazing experience.
So I hear a principle and a tool in here. The tool you're talking about is neuro-linguistic programming. It's NLP. That's the tool you used.
Yep.
But tools are just tools. You can use other tools. The principle is you found a tool that paused your patterns. You had a pattern interrupt in your introverted sensing or memory 10-year-old tertiary long enough for you to force you, or at least give you the opportunity to go into your intuition, your extroverted intuition exploration process.
Yes,
and
exactly.
And the tool you use, you just happen to use NLP, but there's probably other ways. If an INFP is listening right now and they're like, wow, I want to do what Dana does. Maybe I don't have access to NLP, but there's probably other tools that we can look at as for an INFP to put that process on hold, or at least pause it for a moment so you can access the intuition. So I think that's really cool. So the principle is just getting leverage on that process and moving into the intuitive part. And the tool's up to you, I think.
Yeah, I would agree.
So Dana, as we wrap up the conversation here, let's just pretend you've got a time machine. You can go back in time to 15-year-old Dana as a teenager. What does younger Dana need to hear from you? Like, what advice do you have for your younger INFP self that maybe somebody even listening in could hear and use in their life?
Oh, that's such a great question, and I love it. And I would say that 15-year-old Dana really needed to hear who she is completely fine. And if she focuses on what she wants and truly believes to be right for herself and makes decisions that way, that's really going to enable her to create the best life for herself. And by her having a good experience of life, that will help her make the things that she wants to do in the world happen. She doesn't need to worry so much about doing the quote unquote right thing that everybody else is saying. She really needs to listen to that core inner voice.
That's powerful, because what I hear from that is something we don't talk enough about with authenticity or introverted feeling, as far as I'm concerned. We talk about the core values, the principles, getting all that in alignment, things that are authentic. But we forget sometimes to talk about desires, wants, drives, motivations, because that's where all this lives too. And,
yes.
I think you said something really important. It's not just a matter of knowing what you stand for or stand against core value-wise. It's also knowing what you want to do, what your desires are, your true desires, the core desires, not the shadow desires, not like the ones you'll settle for, but the ones you really want at a deep level. I think this is a powerful message for introverted feeling users of all types, but particularly for introverted feeling primaries. I think because you can favor those values so much, you forget, well, what do I even want in life? And so I think you brought up a really important point there.
Thank you. Yeah, because I 100% agree. If I had gone with what I truly wanted back then, I would have studied psychology and my life would have been a lot different. I'm very glad now, because all of the things that happened to me brought me to where I am now, which I'm very, very happy with. But I could have been saved an awful lot of heartache potentially had I known that it was really okay to listen to what do I truly, truly want and what do I truly, truly value. And I think that, yeah, everybody should have a certain amount of that.
Dana, thank you so much for coming on today onto the show, providing insight, talking about how your cognition's wired, your experience and your own growth of discovering your type and growing as a person. We just really appreciate and affirm you being here today. Thank you.
Thank you so much, you guys. I really had the best time. I love Personality Hacker, so this was just a huge treat for me.
So what do you think? You've been listening along. You haven't had a microphone. It's just been three of us talking so far, Dana, Antonia, and myself, but we want to hear from you. Come over to personalityhacker.com. Directly below this episode, leave a comment, ask a question, or more importantly, share your personal story. Are you an INFP? In the midst of your own growth journey, what's that like for you? We'd love to hear about it. Maybe you have an INFP in your life that you relate to, maybe somebody close to you. What's it like being in a relationship with that person or a friendship with that person? We want to hear what's coming up from this conversation with Dana on your side. So come over to personalityhacker.com and make your voice heard.
And if you enjoyed this podcast, you can subscribe to us on iTunes and various Android platforms. If you leave a rating and review for us on iTunes, that helps us out a lot. We have a book. It's called Personality Hacker. You can get it at all major book retailers. And if you leave a rating and review for us on Amazon or on Goodreads, that also helps us out a lot. You heard Dana talking about the cognitive functions for an INFP, introverted feeling, extroverted intuition. Well, the book dives into the cognitive functions that you prefer based on your personality type. So if you want to do a deeper dive into that and understand all the implications of how to develop those functions, check out that book. And if you want to take your growth to the next level, we have a suite of programs that are personal growth oriented through the lens of personality type. So you can head over to personalityhacker.com, and under our catalog of programs, you can see if there's one that's right for you.
My name is Joel Mark Witt.
And I'm Antonia Dodge.
And we'll talk with you on the next Personality Hacker podcast. If you're focused on personal growth, I think you'll resonate with our core content over at personalityhacker.com. We want to see you understand how your mind is wired so you can generate motivation, improve social skills, find career opportunities, and master excellent decision making. But a quick warning, we are advice and action focused in all of our articles, podcasts, and videos. This means that we attract people who like to be challenged to become excellent, to take action, to put in the work to optimize themselves, not simply just gather more information. If you are committed to personal growth and ready to radically find your inner truth, then come over and be a part of our growing community of like minds at Personality Hacker.